A country with 5 million people, almost no oil, almost no factories, and barely any heavy industry, somehow ended up richer on paper than the United States. That's not a typo. Ireland's income per person now sits above what America's does. Higher than Germany. Higher than almost anywhere else on the planet. And the strange part isn't that Ireland got rich. Small countries get rich sometimes. The strange part is how thin the foundation is underneath that wealth. This is a story about a country that figured out something most nations never do. You don't need to build the factory. You just need to be the address on the building. Let's go back to where this started, because Ireland wasn't always the exception. For most of the 20th century, it was the warning. In 1922, Ireland won its independence after centuries under British rule. What it inherited wasn't a functioning economy. It was a shrinking, mostly agricultural country, still recovering from a famine that had gutted its population decades earlier. For the next 30 years, Ireland tried to protect itself from the world. High tariffs, closed borders on trade, the belief that self-sufficiency would eventually pay off. It didn't. By the late 1950s, the country was losing people at an almost unbelievable rate. Between 1951 and 1961, roughly 1 in every 7 Irish citizens packed up and left, mostly for Britain or the United States, not emigrants chasing opportunity. Emigrants fleeing the absence of it. So in 1958, the government commissioned a report to answer one blunt question. Why is this country dying slowly? In peacetime, the answer that came back was uncomfortable. Ireland wasn't dying because it lacked resources. It was dying because it had spent 3 decades locking the rest of the world out. That report didn't fix anything overnight, but it planted an idea that would take 20 years to fully bloom and would eventually rewrite the entire country. By the 1970s, Ireland joined what would become the European Union. And suddenly a small island economy had tariff-free access to hundreds of millions of consumers across the continent. Access alone wasn't the whole plan, though. Ireland still needed a reason for companies to actually show up. So the government made a bet that looked reckless at the time. It slashed corporate tax rates far below what its European neighbors were charging, eventually settling around 10% for born manufacturing, a fraction of what companies were paying in France, Germany, or the UK. Then it paired that low tax rate with something harder to copy. A young, English-speaking, increasingly well-educated workforce, built through free secondary education introduced in the late 1960s. The pitch practically wrote itself. Set up your European headquarters here, sell into the entire EU market, pay almost nothing in tax, hire workers who speak English natively, and cost less than their counterparts across the water. American companies listened. Intel arrived in 1982, then Microsoft. Then, over the following 2 decades, Apple, Google, Meta, Amazon, and a long list of pharmaceutical giants. What started as a trickle of foreign investment became one of the most concentrated corporate migrations in modern economic history. By the mid-1990s, the results were hard to ignore. Economists started calling it the Celtic tiger. Between 1995 and 2000, Ireland's economy grew at nearly 10% a year, a pace usually reserved for rapidly industrializing economies in Asia, not a small Western European democracy. Unemployment collapsed from around 17% to roughly 4%. For the first time in modern Irish history, more people were arriving than leaving. Dublin transformed from a quiet, grey capital into a skyline of glass and cranes. And like most booms built partly on real growth and partly on borrowed confidence, the ground eventually started to soften underneath it. Property prices in Ireland more than tripled between the mid-1990s and mid-2000s. Banks lent aggressively to developers who kept building, regardless of whether anyone actually needed what they were building. Everyone assumed the music would keep playing. It didn't. When the global financial crisis hit in 2008, it exposed just how much of Ireland's banking system had been quietly built on sand. Irish banks were sitting on enormous undisclosed losses. Rather than let them fail, the government made a decision that would define the next decade. It guaranteed the debts of the country's major banks, a promise worth roughly double Ireland's entire annual economic output. When the real scale of the losses became clear, Ireland had no choice but to accept a bailout of over 60 billion euros from the EU, the IMF, and the UK. Unemployment surged back into double digits. Property values collapsed by more than half. Half-finished housing developments sat abandoned across the countryside, empty monuments to a boom that had outrun itself. For a moment it looked like the entire Celtic tiger story might have been an illusion. Here's where Ireland's path splits from countries like Greece or Portugal, which spent years trapped in the same crisis. Underneath all the reckless property lending, the original bet Ireland made decades earlier was still intact. The multinational corporations hadn't left. Intel was still there. The pharmaceutical plants were still running. The tech offices were still employing tens of thousands of people and still generating revenue that flowed straight through the Irish tax system. That quiet, largely invisible engine is what pulled Ireland out of the crisis faster than almost anyone expected. By 2015, Ireland's economy officially grew by 26% in a single year. Economists half joked, half grimaced, calling it Leprechaun economics, because the number wasn't really describing new factories or new jobs. It was describing an accounting shift. As multinationals moved patents, trademarks, and intellectual property onto Irish balance sheets to take advantage of the tax structure. Apple alone was reported to have routed well over $100 billion in profits through the country. Whether you call that real growth or a very sophisticated paper trick, the tax revenue it generated was real. And by 2020, Ireland's income per person had climbed to roughly $104,000, placing it among the very highest in the world, trailing only a handful of tiny tax havens. So what actually happened here? A small country with almost no natural industrial advantage found the one lever it could pull that giant economies couldn't easily copy. Not manufacturing, not agriculture, tax policy and timing. It joined the EU at the right moment. It cut taxes, just as American tech and pharmaceutical companies were expanding globally and searching for exactly this kind of entry point. It built an educated English-speaking workforce right when that combination became valuable. None of that guarantees permanence. An economy this dependent on the tax decisions of foreign corporations is also an economy that could shrink dramatically if those decisions change, whether through new international tax rules, shifting corporate strategy, or political pressure from larger economies who see Ireland's arrangement as something closer to a loophole than a legitimate advantage. Ireland today has real jobs, real innovation, and real prosperity sitting alongside a serious housing shortage and a level of dependence on a handful of American corporations that few economists would call stable long-term. Whether you see modern Ireland as an economic miracle or an elaborate and very lucrative accounting exercise probably depends on which numbers you're looking at. Either way, it raises an uncomfortable question worth sitting with. If the richest countries in the world can be built this quietly, on paper, without most of us noticing how, what else might be hiding in plain sight inside the numbers we take for granted?